Good morning.
Good morning.
In your recent Spring Pathways edition for Virginia Mennonite Conference newsletter, there was an article called VMC Introduces Racial Justice Task Force, written by John Trotter. And I just want to read a little bit from the introduction of that. How can Virginia Mennonite Conference lead in a way that fully includes people of color and non-dominant cultures in all aspects of the decision-making process? How can VMC equip leaders and members of its congregations to deeply listen to stories from non-white voices without defensive postures, and to include those who've been shut out of power structures by understanding the history and making room for other seats at the table? As racial justice and inclusion is a priority for Virginia Conference, a racial justice task force was approved by Conference Council in September 2020 and formed with 8 persons representing a variety of racial and cultural backgrounds in different geographic regions. This morning, we welcome Maren Hange and Vivian Stevens-Lyons, 2 members of the task force, and I'm eager to listen and learn of the work of the task force and their challenge and their exhortations to us as we together seek to be formed and transformed and to be transformers in our broken world as we follow Jesus faithfully. So let's turn our attention to Maren and Vivian.
Thank you, Deb. I welcome you to this next hour, on behalf of the Racial Justice Task Force. The memo from the task force that June Miller sent around on June 4th describes how the task force has begun the work towards becoming an anti-racist conference. Many of you have already done work in your congregation. This is work that is not just done by the task force. This is work that we all need to do together. So today we want to hear from you. How have and will you heed the call to this work? This is hard work. This is messy work. This is not linear work. There is pain and there is beauty. But through the power of the Holy Spirit, this is transforming work and becomes good news. What questions, fears, and hopes do you bring? What steps have you taken and what steps do you struggle with? In the June 26th letter that was shared at last summer's assembly, non-white leaders asked of white leaders to show up and truly participate in the continued conversations on race relations, to change the conversational posture from debating and or dismissing the voices and information shared by persons of color to genuinely listening to understand the experiences and perspectives shared by persons of color, to identify and hold constituent groups and congregations accountable for discontinuing racist practices and policies, to remain vigilant to removing the barriers caused by systemic racism, and to shoulder the responsibility to effect change in partnership with non-white race leaders and constituents. Are we ready to do so? One example from the task force is that at the beginning of our work, we were not given this June 26th letter that Alicia Manning read last summer. Instead, we received a document approved by Conference Council that Deb Horst quoted in the article that was written by John Trotter, Without Knowledge, by the Racial Justice Task Force. Why were we not given the June 26th letter? Was that letter from non-white leaders not clear enough? Not strong enough? Why did it need to be changed? In that step, non-white voices were again silenced and replaced. So as a task force, we have undone that step and are working directly from the June 26th letter. The conference has hired Caleb Schrock-Hurst for the quarter-time staff position that works with the task force. He will begin his work on August 1. Caleb is currently on a bike trip across the country with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions, an initiative sponsored by Eastern Mennonite University, Goshen College, and Mennonite Central Committee. He can't be with us in person. Here's a video introducing himself.
Good morning, Virginia Conference. My name is Caleb Schrockhurst. I'm sorry I can't be with you synchronously at the moment, but I will be on my bike most of the day, and so had to choose to pre-record a message. I'm really excited to be joining the Virginia Conference team and to join the work that the Racial Justice Task Force has already begun. I'm a second-year seminary student at Eastern Mennonite Seminary, and I'm really excited to pair my studies with this work of joining the Racial Justice Task Force. In particular, for me, being a white Mennonite, have been pretty exposed to a lot of international work, via MCC, via my sister's involvement in a Virginia Conference approved mission, and that type of thing. But I think, as with many others over the past few years, have journeyed deeper into understanding how my race has impacted my life here in the U.S. And I kind of started diving deeper into that during my undergraduate days at EMU, when I was able to study a bit with the Black Student Union and take a trip down to South Georgia and study some of the civil rights movement. And then from there, studying at EM Seminary, have also continued to learn about the way race has impacted us as Mennonites and also just as Americans. And I'm really, really excited to be able to work to, connect our churches and continue to dive into this question of how we can be both racially equitable and actively anti-racist as Virginia Mennonite Conference. I look forward to getting to know all of you, and once again, sorry I can't be there in person. Thanks so much.
As I mentioned, this is work we all need to do together. So today we invite you to join us. We will be going into breakout rooms 3 times during this time. The first one will be 17 minutes long. The other 2 will be 12 minutes to give a little time at the beginning to introduce ourselves to each other. Each time will be guided by some questions that will be posted in the chat, and I invite Andrew to do that right now. He will also post a link to a Google Doc form where you can record your notes from this session and have them submitted directly to the task force. Or if you're not able to do so, we will provide you with an email address to send us your notes. So please assign a note taker for your group. And after each breakout session, we will call on 3 groups to give a 1-minute feedback, 1 or 2 insights from your time together. For the groups, please take turns and be lean of expression. Refrain from attempts to fix, save, or set each other straight. Speak the truth from your own experience. Respect each other. Agree to disagree if necessary. For our first breakout room, please introduce yourself and the faith community you present. The questions for the first group are: what is the racial makeup of your faith community, and how does it compare to the demographics of the larger community? What questions, fears, or hopes does the June 26th letter and stories from the winter delegate session or the events of the last year stir up for you? When was the last time you heard a sermon at your church about racial justice or white supremacy? Let us go into our groups. Okay, there were some technical difficulties, but that we have. So we would like to hear from 3 groups. And I'm just gonna call on some groups, just 1 insight. You have 1 minute each. How about groups 6, 12, and 18? Group 6? Do you know whether you were in group 6?
I was in group 6. I took the notes. I'll happily
Thank
share.
you, Matthew.
I think it was powerful to hear from the different contexts of the group members, and also folks were willing to share some powerful stories of how neighbors and congregants had been directly influenced, and what might seem a normal activity on a day brought the police. What might have been a normal activity brought pain and tears and clear brokenness. That it was not based on the action of the people who were treated differently because of the color of their skin. The one story was a mother and her son going to a car dealership to pick out a car, and the dealer called the police as they were looking to purchase a car at that dealership. I think the other thing I would name is each of the congregations that people shared from are at work on this question. What does it mean to open our eyes to the needs of the congregation we are in and the community we are in? So it was neat to hear the work that folks are doing and say we want to keep leaning into it. So I appreciated that sharing from the group members.
Thank you, Matthew. Group 12.
This is Paul Lehman, and I was part of that group and took notes, so I guess I'll respond as well. One of our topics went back to the 70s and 80s when a lot of congregations within Virginia Mennonite Conference, I don't know if adoption is the right word, but in essence, welcomed families that were immigrating into the area, into our congregations, and helped those families settle. And at Harrisonburg Mennonite Church, which would have been one representative in our group, a congregation, a Laos congregation, continues to this day as a result of that. And so one of our questions were, how can we maybe be more active to the immigration population that needs loving support as they come to our communities? I'll just leave it at that.
Paul, group 18.
Hello, I can represent Group 18. I took the notes for our group. My name is Katie from Knoxville Mennonite Church. I think one of the impactful things that came out of this breakout session was just hearing about the fact that this past year has been a time of challenge for all of the groups who were represented. It's been a time of reflection, and I think just hearing about the intersectionality of the work that everyone is doing and trying to address, folks who may not have internet access, and as some other people have shared already, just trying to connect with the community as well as the congregation. And how do we do that in a way that is still rooted in anti-racist work? Another thing that came out of our conversation was just thinking about the term white privilege and how our groups are processing that term and working through some of those feelings on an individual level.
Thank you, Katie. Let us move back to our breakout groups. The question is back in the chat. Thank you, Andrew. And there is another link for the second form for recording notes. During a century in which most American families' best investment was home ownership, Black families were systematically denied mortgages. According to BusinessInsider.com, the median white household was worth $188,200 in 2020. If absolutely forced to hazard a guess, what would you estimate was the median net worth for Black families? Have your church communities had conversations about the wealth gap? Why or why not? Let us go back to our groups. And thank you, June, for all the hard work on the logistics. Welcome back, everybody, from this second session. And let's hear again from three groups. How about 7:30 13 and 19. Somebody from group 7.
That's me. It's Jake Lee, Harrisonburg Mennonite Church. I was taking notes, so now I'm trying to process what we talked about. I think the question was, we see and understand the wealth gap on some level, but how should we work at that? What priority should that have in our congregations? That was the conversations that we had. Some of us saw socioeconomic differences within our congregations and communities, and some of us didn't see those differences. Both were mentioned, so I think that's important to pay attention to, that our congregations actually experience that differently. How do we pay attention to that wealth gap in congregations? What is the work that we're supposed to do? I think we more just had the question than we did any kind of answer to it.
And that's the first step. And maybe I should give you an answer to the question asked.
Oh, that's right. That's
what
right.
did you guess?
We guessed.
What would you estimate?
We guessed. There was one guess of 30, one guess of 20, and one guess of 18.
The answer is 24,100. Thank you, Jay.
Important
Yep.
to note is total wealth, not income.
Thank you, Andrew. Group 13.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Eby, representing Virginia Mennonite in Harrisonburg. So for the first, and I took notes, for the first question, we had a range of 100,000 to down to 15,000. And so, yeah, we had all the numbers in there. So we sort of, one of us at least got close. Yeah, and I think we talked about how sometimes we don't maybe talk about it in the church as large, but maybe relationally, those conversations happen more. And then also the question of practically, where do we move from here, sort of came up. And at the end, running out of time, but sort of trying to figure out, like talking about it and making people aware is a first step. But then after that, sort of where do you go from there?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Group number 19.
I'm Sarah Bixler. I was taking notes for group 19, and we guessed more on the low side. None of us actually got as high as what the actual statistic was. And we noted that that was a median number, so it's not an average, but it's the midpoint, which, yeah, we thought that was important to recognize as well. We talked about the wealth gap in terms of just deliberating over how local congregations can take tangible actions that would impact in some way this larger systemic problem. And that was really a dilemma for us. We could easily describe ways that we are caring for people in our small groups, people who are in some way directly connected to the congregations that where we are and how we seek to provide for immediate needs that we're aware of. But addressing this large issue on a national or even a global level was something that we needed some tools and suggestions for that we didn't have very many of.
Thank you, Sarah. We will now hear from Vivian, her story.
Good morning, everyone. I'm the co-chair of the Racial Justice Task Force, and I shared a story in one of my meetings, and I was asked to share part of my story today. So my great-grandfather was enslaved. great-grandfather. He received no compensation. He was 30 years old when slavery ended. Some of my great aunts and uncles were enslaved. Once free, my great-grandfather had nowhere to live and no way to buy food. Post-slavery, he became a sharecropper. A sharecropper is a tenant farmer who farms land for the owner and is paid a share of the value of the yielded crop. They were still residing on the plantation. They had to purchase food, seed, just basic necessities. And at the end of the year, as a sharecropper, he was told that his expenses exceeded his revenue. My grandfather was born 10 years after slavery ended. He and my father both were sharecroppers until they eventually left the plantation. My family did not receive compensation for the work they performed. My father was a preferred worker as a sharecropper because he worked hard, but he died early, much earlier than any of his other siblings. Generational poverty. My father eventually secured a job as a laborer in a factory, Union Camp, now International Paper. But when I was 10 years old, my father died suddenly. My mom worked seasonally in a factory. She was laid off more than she worked. At the time of my father's death, my mom did not meet the age requirement for Social Security benefits from my father. I received a small Social Security check. Very shortly after my father's death, my mother was suddenly disabled. It was a while before we received Social Security after my father's death and after my mom's illness. My older siblings pitched in financially until we received a small check each month. We still have the same financial responsibilities of rent, food, utilities, and everyday household expenses. We went from a 1.5 income family to living on Social Security. In the midst of all of this, at 10 years of age, we had to relocate. Those two incidents affected me emotionally and financially. I was born 2 years after Brown versus Board of Education. In Brown versus Board, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Up until age 14, I attended a segregated but supposedly equal public school with outdated textbooks that my mother had to purchase. This is the prime environment for a negative outcome I had to overcome. As a teenager, I would wake up at 5 in the morning to catch a 6 a.m. bus to commute 1.5 hours one way to college and then return home around 6 p.m. That was a struggle. And I think prior to my mother's passing, she was receiving maybe $600 to $700 a month. I recall purchasing her medicine. There was no way she could afford medicine and other basic necessities. I couldn't believe the cost of medication. My sister, right now, who has a college degree, receives about $700 in supplemental security income and $7 in food stamps. She became mentally ill around age 27 in the prime of her career. She didn't work enough quarters to receive Social Security. I supplement her income and provide transportation for her. I am first generation wealth, meaning I started out in life with no inheritance, $0, no home ownership. Some parts of my story concerning my mother are too painful to share. As I revisited all of this brought a wave of grief. I wanted to go lie on my dad's grave to tell him how much I appreciated the sacrifices he made throughout his life. He was a second-class working citizen who worked for free an enormous part of his life and died early. Although my story may be different from others, my story is not an anomaly. Thanks for allowing me to share.
Thank you, Vivian. Let us take a minute to hold Vivian's story. This is not some theoretical work we are doing here. This is work that impacts real people in our churches. So let us move to our final breakout rooms. The questions and the Google Doc form response link are in the chat again. What would have to change in your faith community to become more anti-racist? What is one thing you can do without any additional resources or authority? What is something the Racial Justice Task Force can do to help you move forward in the work of anti-racism in your respective community? We are not just about talking. We want to act, we want to move towards action in overcoming anti-racism. So let us go back to our breakout rooms. Welcome back, everybody, from this third time. How do we move into action? Let's hear again from three groups. How about 8, 14, and 20? Somebody from group 8?
Group 8, and one of the things that Daniel's run Peace Church is doing, they're a very diverse church, and they're looking to make sure that their leadership reflects the people in their church. And one of the stories that Tig shared was that when they picked the songs, that there was 2 white people always picking the songs, and that didn't represent their group of people on their committee. And that they intentionally, just a couple weeks ago, started including other people to bring different voices. And with the voices together, there's lots of songs that are in different languages, and doing the hard work to learn the verses and the pronunciation of the words. That's one of the things that they're working on with that. And another person on our committee talked about that, the hard work of what's the gospel informing us in our relationships, and to think about that with the people, the diverse people in our churches and in our communities.
Thank you, Viva. Group 14.
That's me, David Gingrich. I was a recorder for our group. Unfortunately, the highlight from our group is that we have a lot more questions than we do answers. But one of the things we talked about is relationship, and that for us, modeling, being a third way in conversations, and being able to live as bearers of the gospel rather than reactionary, maybe with certain language that's used in conversations or other things, rather than reacting, to model a posture of listening, receiving, and being a third way. The other thing we talked about is one of us has a congregation that meets in their building that is a Hispanic congregation. Another has a neighboring church that is African American. And we talked about the importance of encouraging relationships, personal relationships across social barriers, that policies often do not do as much as they hope to. It starts with relationships. And for one community, it's the suggestion was inviting pastors from these other congregations in to preach. And for another one of us, it was saying, well, we also need to go and experience being a minority in another congregation, in a community of color, even if it's a different language, community of a different language. You know, there are going to be cultural differences, even if the language is the same. But going into a situation where you are unable to understand the majority of what's going on is also a helpful tool in learning what it means to experience that from the other side.
Thank you, David. Group 20, and please note, if you were a note taker and used the Google Doc form, please press submit at the bottom so Andrew can receive those. Group 20. Nobody from group 20? I don't know who was in the individual groups. Well, we are over time anyhow, and we're already in break time. So thank you all for engaging with us. And if you have any suggestions, questions for the task force, feel free to contact us. So may we go in the hope and power of the words that Jesus quoted at the beginning of his ministry. As he was sent to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners. May we do likewise. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Maren and Vivian, for important, challenging work. We have much work to do and much prayer. We will be taking a break until 10:30, and we will come back and enter into another time of worship and meditation. So thank you so much, everyone.